the myth of the first Americans for nearly a century. The story of how humans first reached the Americas seemed clear, logical, and complete. It was a tale told in classrooms, museums, and textbooks. A tale of courage, survival, and discovery. Ask any schoolchild how the first people arrived in the New World, and you would likely hear the same familiar version. A group of brave hunters, wrapped in thick furs, crossed a frozen bridge of land and ice that once connected Siberia to Alaska. They followed herds of mammoth and bison across this barren expanse, driven by hunger and the instinct to survive. When the glaciers began to melt, they marched south through a narrow corridor between walls of ice, stepping into an untouched wilderness filled with life. That frozen bridge, the Bering Land Bridge, was called Beringia, a subcontinent that no longer exists, now drowned beneath the icy waters of the Bering Strait. According to generations of scientists, this was the entryway to a new world. From this migration sprang the first Americans, who spread rapidly across the continent, leaving behind tools, bones, and clues to their astonishing journey. It was a neat story, clean, efficient, and easy to teach. For decades, it defined what we thought we knew about our own species' history. The first humans in the Americas were said to be the Clovis people, a culture named after a small town in New Mexico where their distinctive stone spear points were first discovered. These artifacts, perfectly shaped and finely fluted, were dated to around 13,000 years ago. To archaeologists, these tools weren't just weapons. They were the fingerprints of the first Americans, the evidence of the people who conquered a continent. The Slovis first model became scientific law. Every other theory had to fit around it, and anything that didn't was quietly dismissed. It was elegant, logical, and it matched the timing of the last great ice age, when glaciers began to recede and the land bridge was still exposed. But science, like history, rarely stays neat for long. Over the years, the cracks began to show, faint at first, then widening into fractures that could no longer be ignored. The first whispers of doubt came from unexpected places: caves, river beds, and footprints fossilized in ancient mud. And with each discovery, the old story of the Clovis hunters began to unravel. In Oregon's Paisley Caves, researchers uncovered fossilized human DNA embedded in animal dung. The samples were tested again and again, each time returning a date of over 14,000 years ago, long before the supposed arrival of the Clovis people. Then came another shock from White Sands, New Mexico. In the powdery lakebeds of an ancient shoreline, scientists found human footprints, dozens of them, pressed into the sediment of a vanished world. Tiny prints of children running beside larger ones, frozen in time. The dating was clear: 23,000 years old. This was not a minor adjustment. It wasn't a matter of a few hundred years. It was a revelation that pushed back the human story in the Americas by nearly 10,000 years, and shattered the timeline that generations of archaeologists had built their careers upon. If humans were already living in the southern parts of North America over 20,000 years ago, then the land bridge theory could not stand as the full explanation. Because at that time, a vast wall of ice, miles thick and thousands of kilometers wide, stretched across Canada, sealing off the continent from the north. The question became unavoidable: if they didn't come through the ice, how did they get here? That question is what sparked one of the most intense scientific debates of the modern age. A debate that would drag historians, geologists, geneticists, and archaeologists into a new kind of mystery. To understand just how radical this challenge was, we need to step back into the Ice Age itself, to the frozen heart of North America around 20,000 years ago. At that time, the continent was unrecognizable. What is now Canada lay buried under two massive glaciers, the Laurentide ice sheet to the east and the Cordilleran ice sheet to the west. These weren't patches of snow or thin layers of ice. They were mountain-sized walls that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. In some places, they reached heights of over 3 kilometers. They swallowed everything in their path: forests, mountains, rivers, even entire valleys. Between them, there was no open land, no clear route, only endless ice. This meant that anyone trying to walk from Alaska into the heart of North America faced an impossible obstacle: a frozen prison stretching from horizon to horizon. Yet somehow, evidence of human presence kept turning up far beyond it. The Clovis first model had rested on one key assumption: that when these glaciers began to melt, around 15,000 years ago, they opened a narrow path between them known as the ice-free corridor. It was believed that this corridor provided the first migrants with a passage southward into the continent. For generations, this was accepted as fact, but new research revealed a fatal flaw in that logic. Just because the corridor was open didn't mean it was alive. The earliest scientists imagined a route lined with grass and game, mammoths, bison, and reindeer roaming freely as human hunters followed. But when modern researchers began to examine what the corridor actually looked like at that time, they found something else entirely. It wasn't a lush valley. It was a dead zone, a wasteland of mud, ice, and meltwater. It was clear that no human, no matter how skilled, could have survived that journey without food, water, or shelter. 1,000 kilometers of nothingness stretched between Alaska and the open plains of the South. The question then became, when did this corridor truly come alive? When did it become habitable? To answer that, scientists turned to an extraordinary tool: environmental DNA, or eDNA. Unlike fossils or bones, eDNA captures the genetic traces of life itself, microscopic fragments of DNA shed by plants, animals, and even bacteria into the soil. These fragments cling to tiny particles of clay and sediment, surviving for tens of thousands of years. By analyzing them layer by layer, scientists can reconstruct ancient ecosystems in astonishing detail. A team of researchers focused their efforts on what is now northern British Columbia and Alberta, near the ancient basin of glacial Lake Peace. It was here, between the last retreating fingers of the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, that the final segment of the ice-free corridor once existed. They drilled deep into the mud at the bottom of two modern lakes, the remnants of that ancient glacial sea. What they found inside those sediment cores was nothing short of a time machine. Each layer of mud represented a year, sometimes a season, locked in place like pages in a frozen diary. Inside, they could read the story of life returning to a dead world, molecule by molecule. The results were shocking. Around 15,000 years ago, as the ice began to melt, the region remained barren. There were no trees, no shrubs, not even grass, only silt ice and frigid meltwater. By 13,000 years ago, when the Clovis people were supposedly trekking through the corridor, it was still lifeless. No animals, no edible plants, no signs of warmth or soil. It wasn't until 600 years ago that the DNA revealed a sudden, dramatic change. The first plants began to appear, hardy species like sagebrush and willow, capable of surviving the bitter cold. Shortly after, traces of animal life emerged: bison, woolly mammoth, hare, and even the earliest birds. This was the rebirth of the corridor, a green thread slowly weaving its way through the ice. But it came too late. By the time this region became habitable, humans had already been living thousands of miles to the south for thousands of years. That discovery changed everything. The ice-free corridor could no longer be the route for the first Americans. It was open, but not alive soon enough to support them. If the land bridge and the corridor were both closed doors, then how did humans reach the New World? The answer, scientists now believe, may lie not in the frozen north, but in the rolling waves of the Pacific Ocean. Along the western edge of the continent, where the ice never reached the shore, there may have existed a thin ribbon of life: kelp forests, rocky islands, and rich coastal waters teeming with fish and seals. This was the Pacific Coastal Route theory, an idea once dismissed as pure speculation, now resurrected by new evidence. It suggests that the first Americans didn't walk across a continent. They sailed along it. They might have used small boats or rafts hugging the coastline, moving from one unglaciated refuge to another. A kelp highway of marine abundance. To survive the Ice Age, they didn't need mammoths or open plains, they needed the sea. And when they reached the shores of the Pacific Northwest, they would have found river mouths leading inland, valleys untouched by ice, and a new world waiting to be explored. The more we learn, the clearer it becomes that the story of the first Americans is not a simple line drawn across a map. It's a web, a complex, shifting journey shaped by courage, chance, and adaptation. The Clovis first model wasn't wrong because it lacked logic. It was wrong because it underestimated the ingenuity of early humans. They were not passive wanderers waiting for glaciers to melt. They were explorers, navigators, and survivors who saw opportunity where others saw impossibility. And as modern science continues to peel back the layers of ice and time, one truth becomes clear: the first Americans were far older, more adaptable, and more resourceful than we ever imagined. The lost road of the first Americans. If the ice-free corridor was a locked door, then somewhere along the frozen edge of the Pacific Ocean lay a hidden key, a route no one could see from the glaciers above, a highway of waves, kelp, and wind. For years, the idea that the first humans to reach the Americas might have traveled by sea was seen as far-fetched, almost impossible. The image of Ice Age hunters braving a freezing ocean in small boats didn't fit the tidy narrative of migration through land. But the deeper scientists looked, the more that impossible story began to make sense. To understand why, we must imagine the world as it was 20,000 years ago, during the peak of the last Ice Age. Vast portions of the planet's water were trapped in glaciers. Sea levels were lower, in some places by more than 400 feet. What is now a network of islands and deep bays along the Pacific coast was, back then, a single continuous ribbon of land stretching from Asia to North America. This landscape was not buried beneath the ice, it was alive. Where the mountains met the sea, a narrow band of coastline remained ice-free, nourished by ocean currents, covered in kelp forests, and rich in marine life. For anyone capable of navigating it, this was a living highway, a path of abundance running parallel to the frozen interior. For years, the coastal route was dismissed because so much of it now lies underwater. The rising seas that followed the Ice Age drowned the ancient shorelines, hiding the evidence that might confirm this theory. But in recent decades, science has begun to reclaim that hidden world. Through undersea mapping, sediment sampling, and ancient DNA analysis, researchers have started to piece together fragments of a journey once thought impossible. The story begins far from the Americas. On the edge of northeastern Asia, where the ancestors of the first Americans once lived. These were not primitive wanderers, but skilled Ice Age hunter-gatherers who had already adapted to harsh coastal environments. They hunted seals and sea lions, gathered shellfish, and used bone-tipped harpoons and fishing tools. Archaeological sites in Siberia and Japan, some more than 25,000 years old, show evidence of people who understood the sea intimately, who could build rafts or simple boats and travel along the coastline for food and trade. If they could master the cold waters of the Sea of Japan and the Bering Coast, then the journey across Beringia, that now submerged land bridge between Asia and Alaska, would not have been a leap of faith. It would have been a continuation of their world. These were people who followed the edge of the ice, living between land and sea. To them, the ocean was not a barrier, it was a road. And it is along this forgotten road that the first great migration likely began, around 17,000 to 15,000 years ago, as the ice sheets began their slow retreat. A corridor of open coastline emerged between the Pacific and the glaciers. This stretch of land extended from the Russian Far East across the Aleutian Islands, then down through southern Alaska, British Columbia, and beyond. It was not easy ground. Jagged cliffs, roaring winds, and unpredictable tides made travel perilous. but compared to the frozen wastelands inland, this coastal edge was paradise. The ocean provided everything: fish, seaweed, birds, seals, and driftwood for fires. Kelp forests stretching for miles created calm waters and abundant food. Scientists now call this stretch of coastline the Kelp Highway. To early humans, this highway may have been the only route into the Americas that truly worked. And while their footprints may have long since vanished under the waves, the clues they left behind on land still whisper their story. On the windswept shores of Haida Gwaii, an archipelago off the coast of British Columbia, researchers discovered stone tools buried deep beneath layers of peat and clay. These tools, carefully crafted from obsidian and quartz, date back more than 13,000 years. Evidence of early human presence long before the Clovis culture emerged inland. Even older hints have surfaced on Tricket Island, also in British Columbia, where archaeologists uncovered hearths, spear points, and burnt wood dated to 14,000 years ago. What's extraordinary about Tricket Island is that it has remained habitable since the Ice Age, protected by ocean currents that kept it free of ice even at the coldest periods. For thousands of years, it may have been a safe harbor for the first coastal travelers, a resting place in an age of glaciers. But the most astonishing evidence came from far to the north, on Prince of Wales Island in Alaska. Deep inside a limestone cave known as On Your Knees Cave, archaeologists discovered fragments of a human skeleton. The remains of a young man who lived around 300 years ago. His DNA revealed something extraordinary, a genetic lineage that matched the earliest indigenous populations of the Americas, distinct from later migrations. Even more compelling were the animal bones and fish, remains found beside him, evidence that his people lived by the sea, thriving on a maritime diet of fish, seals, and seabirds. This was proof that early Americans were not just hunters of mammoths, they were also seafarers, capable of adapting to a complex coastal world. Each discovery pushed the timeline further back and the truth further from the old Slavis. First, belief. The deeper scientists dug, the older the evidence became. Still, there was a major challenge. The coastline where these early people would have lived, the beaches, camps, and coves, now lies deep beneath the ocean, hidden beneath layers of silt and rock. Finding direct proof meant looking in places no one had searched before. That's why a team of researchers from the University of Oregon and the Canadian Geological Survey began to explore the seafloor using sonar mapping and underwater archaeology. Off the coast of British Columbia, they found what appeared to be an ancient river channel, now submerged more than 150 feet below the surface. Along its edges were features resembling hearths and stone structures, remnants of what could be one of the oldest coastal settlements in the Americas, dated to roughly 14,000 years ago. The more scientists explored, the more the pieces began to fit together. The timeline of deglaciation, the retreat of ice from the Pacific coast, lined up perfectly with the appearance of these early sites. As the glaciers withdrew, the coastal route opened up gradually, allowing humans to move south. The earliest evidence from southern Chile, at sites like Monte Verde, suggests that people had already reached the far end of South America by at least 14,500 years ago, possibly earlier. That means they must have been traveling along the coast for thousands of years before then. It's staggering to think about small bands of humans, perhaps a few dozen at a time, slowly moving down the continent's edge, navigating by stars, following the rhythm of the tides, and settling wherever food and shelter were abundant. Each generation may have traveled only a few hundred kilometers farther than the last, but over centuries they covered the entire Pacific Rim. And what makes this theory even more compelling is that it fits the biology. Genetic studies of indigenous peoples in the Americas have identified ancient lineages that split from Asian ancestors more than 20,000 years ago, long before the ice ice-free corridor opened. This suggests that their ancestors may have lived in isolation for thousands of years, possibly on coastal refuges, pockets of habitable land that remained ice-free along the Pacific during the Ice Age. These people weren't wandering blindly, they were surviving, adapting, and waiting for the ice to recede. Over time, they would have moved south into what is now Washington, Oregon, and California, regions that were gradually warming, covered in conifer forests and rivers rich with salmon. From there, they spread inland, following valleys and river systems, reaching the Great Plains and beyond. By the time the ice-free corridor finally became habitable around 12,600 years ago, humans were already established thousands of miles to the south, in places like New Mexico, Texas, and even Patagonia. The coastal theory does not merely rewrite geography, it redefines human capability. It challenges the assumption that early humans were limited by the land beneath their feet. Instead, it shows them as innovators, people who saw in the sea not fear, but opportunity. To navigate icy waters in small boats, they would have needed knowledge of tides, winds, and materials. They would have had to build vessels sturdy enough to carry families and supplies, yet light enough to be hauled ashore. And above all, they would have needed courage, the kind that defines explorers in every age. One of the strongest modern analogies comes from the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, such as the Haida, Tlingit, and Coast Salish nations. Their rich maritime cultures, with deep knowledge of canoe building, ocean currents, and navigation, may preserve echoes of those ancient coastal traditions. The continuity of this knowledge, passed through millennia, suggests that the sea has always been central to life on this edge of the world. And so, the coastal migration theory doesn't just explain how humans reached the Americas. It honors the legacy of those who made that journey. It paints them not as wanderers chasing mammoths through frozen valleys, but as navigators steering toward a new world, guided by instinct, curiosity, and resilience. As we uncover more evidence, the story grows richer, more human, and more complex. Beneath the seafloor, preserved in cold sediment, lies the next frontier of discovery, the drowned coastlines of the first Americans. Teams are now using deep-sea drones, submersible cameras, and sediment DNA analysis to search for these ancient settlements. Each new dive, each sample, may bring us closer to the day when we finally find the true footsteps of the first voyagers. But even without that ultimate proof, the narrative has already changed forever. The once absolute certainty of the Clovis first model has given way to a far deeper and more inspiring truth. That human exploration began not when the ice melted, but long before, when a small group of visionaries dared to follow the edge of the world. They didn't wait for nature to make a way, they made one themselves. The redefinition of origins. The story of the first Americans was once simple, too simple. For more than half a century, it stood as an unchallenged monument in science. The Clovis first model, a clean, straightforward narrative of discovery and migration. But truth rarely fits neatly into boxes, and the new evidence has forced us to see humanity's journey not as a straight line, but as a vast web, one that stretches across oceans, ice, and time itself. Today, scientists no longer speak of a single migration or a single route into the Americas. Instead, they speak of a tapestry of arrivals, a story of multiple waves of exploration, survival, and adaptation. And the deeper we dig, both literally and genetically, the more astonishing the picture becomes. It begins with DNA, the microscopic memory of life. For decades, archaeology provided the artifacts, stone tools, bones, and hearths. But genetics has supplied the voices, and those voices tell a story of deep separation and long endurance. Modern genetic analyses of indigenous peoples across the Americas have revealed that their ancestors diverged from Asian populations over 25,000 years ago. That's long before the ice sheets began to melt and thousands of years before the supposed opening of the Bering Land Bridge. But what's more striking is what happened next. Those early ancestors didn't immediately move into the Americas. Instead, they appear to have been isolated, genetically cut off from their Asian relatives for nearly 10,000 years. Where did they live during that time? The answer may lie in Beringia, the now submerged landmass that once stretched from Siberia to Alaska. Far from being an empty wasteland, Beringia may have been a refuge, a stable, productive region of grasslands, rivers, and coastline that supported human life, even at the height of the Ice Age. Scientists call this mysterious period the Beringian standstill. During these millennia of isolation, the ancestors of the first Americans adapted to their harsh environment. Their genetic markers began to shift, creating unique lineages found nowhere else on Earth. They lived among mammoths and reindeer, hunted fish in frozen rivers, and waited, generation after generation, as the ice around them slowly withdrew. When the glaciers finally began to crumble and the sea levels rose, these people didn't hesitate. They were ready, and so, sometime between 17,000 and 15,000 years ago, the descendants of those Beringian survivors began to move, some following the newly exposed Pacific coast southward, others venturing inland as the ice retreated. What followed was one of the greatest migrations in human history. Within just a few thousand years, humans spread from the Arctic Circle to the southern tip of South America, a journey of more than 15,000 kilometers across deserts, mountains, and forests. No other species in Earth's history had ever adapted so swiftly, so intelligently, or so completely to every ecosystem it encountered. At sites like Monte Verde in Chile, archaeologists have uncovered traces of camps, wooden tools, and plant fibers dating to 14,500 years ago. The remains tell of people who built shelters, cooked meals, and crafted tools in a lush, temperate landscape, an image far removed from the frozen tundras of the north. Monte Verde shattered every assumption, proving that humans had reached the southern end of the continent long before the ice-free corridor could have been used. Further north, in Buttermilk Creek, Texas, layers of sediment revealed a hidden world beneath the Clovis horizon. Stone tools and flakes dating back 15,500 years, a full millennium older than the oldest Clovis sites, pointed to an even earlier population, one that may have been the ancestors of the Clovis themselves. These pre-Clovis peoples were innovators. They mastered diverse tools, adapted to local materials, and exploited an astonishing range of environments. From the coastal kelp forests of California to the vast plains of the interior. But this new story isn't just about migration.